场专题演讲，欢迎本场次主持人，国立台湾师范大学音乐学院陈晓芬院长。Distinguished guests, we will now proceed with the third keynote speech. We are honored to welcome the session chair, Xiaofeng Chen from the College of Music, from the National Taiwan Normal University, and welcome.
Vice President Dr. Song and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first International Conference on Education for Middle-Aged and Older Adults, year 2025. We are approaching the end of the two-day conference, but it's my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer McRitchie from the UK, okay? And she's going to present a keynote address titled Designing Music Education and Interaction for Older Adults. With a doctoral degree in electronics with music engineering at the University of Glasgow, Dr. McRitchie has a very special background in electronic engineering, music, and cognitive science. Her research focuses on the acquisition and development of motor skills in instrumental performance and how these skills can be used to promote health and well-being. She joined the music department at the University of Sheffield in year 2021, where she designs new musical technologies for older adults, particularly those living with dementia. Let's welcome Dr. McRitchie.
Many thanks for that introduction. I'm just checking you can all still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. So it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for being willing to have me here virtually as well as I can be with you in the room today. But I'm very happy to be presenting in this conference and for you all to be here right at the very end. So I'm sure you have had quite a lot of ideas and stimulation, and I hope you have room for just a little bit more. So as has been said, my work is primarily looking at older adults and ways that we can stimulate new opportunities for music education and interaction. And as has also been said, I kind of was first looking at this from a kind of expert piano performance angle. So my background, my PhD work, was very much in looking at experts capturing different measurements of how they demonstrated this expert skill. And it led me to thinking about how we get into learning a musical instrument and what this might mean for people who aren't expert pianists. And this is where I really started to narrow in on looking at older adults. At the same time, along with music therapist colleagues, we've been pulling together research about music and health and how this might be applied across different contexts and for different purposes. Now, there's always some confusion over professional roles and level of expertise, particularly in the UK and Australia where we were doing this work. But it's led us to think about how music education and forms of music interaction might be used for many different purposes. And these might have more to do with personal enjoyment and achievement, or they may be more towards the therapeutic goals. Now, this isn't to say there's one correct way to design a piece of technology for people to interact with music, and hopefully that will become evident as we go on. Perhaps just to have a bit of background as to why music participation in older adulthood may be beneficial and how that happens at the moment. We have a lot of research that looks around if an older adult is enabled to continue being a musician, then that is really a core part of their healthy older adult identity. And we find that looking at amateur orchestra players as one example, older adults there are having to assess that balance between the kind of physical and the cognitive challenges of continuing playing instruments with kind of those changing resources as we get into older adulthood. Now, despite this, there's numerous well-being benefits reported, and that is something that is enabled again by having multiple entry points for lifelong engagement with music. So it's not just for people who have managed to continue being a musician throughout their lives, but a particular goal is to try and ensure that there's multiple ways to come back or to come anew to playing a musical instrument or being musical in some way. That being said, there is a lot of difficulty for older adulthoods to change whether they feel that they are already a musician or not. So there is quite a strong psychological barrier as to whether somebody can be musical or not based on their past experiences. But the good news of this is that experiences can change the likelihood of engaging further. So the question starts to become, how can we design musical activities or experiences that either allow someone to continue feeling like they are a musician or can come anew to being musical in some way? So I put this, yes, for those who participate, music holds immense value. And what I'm trying to highlight there is that there are a lot of people who, for one reason or another, are not currently participating. So how might we support them? For me, there is a couple of opportunities for educational technology and music that I want to highlight here that I've kind of already said. One might be it provides an entryway to music making that has been, for some reason, been previously unavailable to a person in their previous lifespan. Or it's a form of accessible music interaction that might help older adults meet some of those changing needs. But what does accessibility truly mean? It's a big question, and I'm not sure I will answer that fully today. I think the idea of making a new musical instrument or a new music technology to be more easily learnable is not something that is particularly new right now. There's quite a lot of history of people making musical interfaces easier. This is one of my favourites I like to show. It's a musical instrument called the color chord, and it was made by a German-born Australian artist, Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack. This is a picture taken from the National Gallery of Australia. If you turn the block round to its different faces, you'll see the colours on the kind of right-hand side top. This is a great way of looking at it. So you turn the block round to the right colour and strum the chord. And then you'll be able to follow colour notes on, well, it wouldn't have been a screen at that time, but we could have it on a piece of paper for a screen, and then you could play the chords as necessary without perhaps having to change fingers on the fret of a guitar, let's say. But I guess one of the risks that we face in having technology as a solution to making musical instruments easier is perhaps even having that technology might not be the key to having somebody being able to play. And I take this kind of inspiration from Amanda Krause and Jane Davidson's work in residential care homes in Australia, where they found even for music listening, having technology available didn't necessarily increase older adults' music listening in those care settings. So the opportunity, the presence of a piece of technology, is also sometimes not enough to solve the problem. We could also argue that we might fall into the trap of what we refer to as techno-solutionism. So the idea that just having the right technology will fix the problem, whatever that problem is. And there's quite a lot of academic discussion on this, particularly in around music and disability, in thinking about just having the right piece of technology will fix the problem. The issue there is that if we are designing that technology, we're designing beliefs about the music into the technologies themselves. So we may be putting up potential barriers or ingraining particular images of what music interaction and learning should be just by the choices that we make in terms of these pieces of technology. what Andrew McPherson, who's that author that I referred to there, and his colleagues refer to is instead thinking about designing context for musicking. So how might we design a piece of technology to fit not only the aspect of making music, but all of those relational and social dimensions that give rise to that meaning when we make music together, rather than simply looking at it as a case of being able to make one note and then the next note. We could argue we might not even know what the problem is. A really interesting piece of research in Europe is the Music for Parkinson's project. And here we hear a lot of music being used in this health context for aiding with walking. What Dawn Rose and her colleagues have found out is that by speaking to people living with Parkinson's, actually that is the least common use that they use music for as well. You could argue that when we look at it from a dementia context, a very popular use of music is in reminiscence. So this idea of using music to stimulate past memories. But again, if we design technology around these particular ideas and only these particular ideas, then people may be seen as only passive receivers of an intervention. So we may risk reducing music to an intervention that is given to someone, rather than trying to design these contexts for musicking. So what I'm going to do is discuss two main projects that I've been involved in, one in Australia and one in the UK. And they come at looking at technology in music education from two very different angles, but hopefully you will see some relevance between the two. The first was really looking at music training as a method for cognitive gain for older adults. So is there, this kind of really relates to the research around whether music instrument learning is an ideal cognitive training intervention that we could use to stimulate brain health, essentially. Now, there's many criticisms of this type of research. There is an argument that we don't know if it's in fact pre-existing factors that determine who takes and succeeds with music education versus whether music education is responsible for kind of cognitive advantages in extra musical activities. There has also been weak effects observed when looking at this from a meta-analysis. And then there's questions as to whether we've examined the different modes of music making enough and long enough to know the answer. So music training, when described in these research studies, is often very broad and undefined, when there are lots of different variations as to what might constitute a music education program. The kind of current research studies in this particular realm that are intervention-based, there is a current group within Europe, led by Eckhart Altendoor, that have the longest term study so far. So they've looked at 12 months of music education for older adults, when typically other studies have been much shorter term. There's been 2 weeks of improvisation training, looked at by Jennifer Bugos and her colleagues. There's been another 8 to 10 weeks of improvisation training in Australia by Anita Connell. So essentially these are very short-term studies initially, and they're not too focused on what people are, in fact, their music performance accuracy. Any attempts to link the kind of music learning outcomes with the general cognitive outcomes have been very thin. So there's not much that kind of links those two together. This was the impetus for some of our work in Australia, trying to think about a long-term music education program. So this is the Active Mind Music Ensemble project. We have our most recent publication is just about to come out in +1, so forgive me if you don't get that by immediately searching that one there. Our experimental design is as follows. We had a 12-month training program where older adults took part in lessons once every 2 weeks, but they had daily practice assigned. They were focused on right-hand melodies. The reason for that I will explain in a minute. And then we were really keen at looking at different instruments and different musical tasks. So for each person involved in the training process, they would have either 6 months of piano keyboard or 6 months on thumb jam, which is a similarly kind of laid out keys on an iPad, so you're still playing single notes. This is why we chose just right-hand melodies instead of two hands together, so that we could have some comparison across those two instruments. Within those two instruments, they also learned 2 different types of tasks. So melodic replication is just another term for what we would consider as standard music education. So learning how to perform well-known songs, or at least pre-composed ones. The other task that they did was a form of melodic improvisation, which I will also kind of explain a little bit more in the next slide. We had about 68 older adults across in 10 different classes that we ran for a full year, and throughout this year we were taking different data collection sessions that would measure their music performance abilities as well as their general cognitive abilities in different tests. The improvisation was based on something that our collaborator Roger Dean had described in his research and many kind of publications on improvisation. Now, these again were single hand melodies. Remember, we restricted them to a certain note range. What we did was give an oral prompt. That's what I should have mentioned. All of this was oral training rather than based on any notation or score. So in the improvisation task, participants would be given a prompt of 3 to 5 notes, and then they were to choose one of these 14 different tools that they could use to try and vary those notes for a set amount of time. I won't read those all out, but essentially it was giving our older adults a toolbox that they could use to vary a specific prompt. So that is obviously one form of improvisation. We could have chosen a raft of others, but that is the one that we've chosen for our programme. I did mention that we took quite a lot of repeated measures during this time. So every 3 months, our older adults were doing a raft of tests, and we also got them back for a 3 and 6 month follow-up after they had finished. And I think a kind of original contribution from this study was it wasn't just looking at those kind of broader cognitive skills, but was very focused on taking measurements of the music skill development of older adults as well. So we had various tasks that we would ask the older adults to do at each 3 month juncture that would give us some idea of their musical development as well. I'd like to take a brief moment to talk about the use of online technology in arts participation. I've kind of walked you through the design of what our programme was in Australia. That was initially conceived of as a face-to-face programme design, and of course we started just before 2020, so very quickly during COVID we had to transfer everything into an online procedure. But that did give us the opportunity to really think about how online technologies and platforms such as Zoom and Skype might be useful in arts education and arts activities. So we do have a couple of publications based on that. One was looking at how arts facilitators were adapting programs during COVID online for people living with dementia. And again, it kind of thinks about these different entryways for contribution and different activities that people can do so that they all feel part of a kind of structured, purposeful, meaningful community. And in our particular Active Minds project, it gave us a chance to really compare the experience of online lessons to in-person group lessons as well. So there's a bit of information if you're interested more in those experiences that really talk about the new skills that people are feeling that they're taking up by being online, and discussions on how that social contact is slightly different within that online setting. I can give you a brief kind of overview of that just now. So we had 13 of our 68 participants had the experience of both in-person lessons and online lessons, so we thought this was a great target group to investigate further and to tell us a little bit about that comparison. So they have many different things that they pick out on the types of the kind of setting and how that might be different. An interesting one for me was one of the quotes that mentions the facilitator is managing the class better online than in the classroom, where they are equally for him in the screen rather than being in a classroom setting. They were set up in a horseshoe shape in the in-person setting. So there was kind of lots of descriptions about how the dynamics of the class in fact changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes not, but I think that was a really interesting point. And also thinking about how do we get feedback from doing something good or bad. You get feedback from people's faces, and you can see them a lot more clearly on the screen, perhaps, than you can if you're sitting in a classroom, depending on how that's set up. I'll just kind of go through this very quickly because obviously older adults have a lot of different experiences and competencies with using kind of online technology. So there's a bit that describes their experiences with this. But I think the key thing that I wanted to communicate was the social interaction side of it, was that people were, I think, if they were restricted from being present within those in-person settings, they did manage to have those kind of social interactions in online lessons. The other kind of qualitative data that we were picking up through the comparison of using that iPad-based instrument versus the kind of very typical electronic piano keyboard, people were responding about how it was very portable and a range of sounds, even though there was in fact a range of sounds on the piano keyboard. But they were very keenly aware of the kind of thin, tinny piano sounds that the iPad was making, the very thin keys, and the kind of restrictive surface that it was giving them to do the musical tasks that we were asking them to. I'll give you a bit of a brief overview of some of those musical results then. So the programme has concluded and we are finishing off our last pieces of analysis and publishing those. So there is, we had to develop new ways of automatically assessing people's music performance skills. Now that has been perhaps a well-trodden path when thinking about how accurately people can reproduce a well-known song. But in terms of assessing people's improvisation skills, we had to develop some new algorithms that would try and assess that, purely because of the amount of performances that we had selected. But certainly we were doing that alongside the evaluations of the music teacher within the programme as well. But perhaps one of the more interesting results from that study is in their musical skills in general. One of the tests that we used was the Goldsmith's Music Sophistication Index, the melodic detection task from this. It's essentially a set of melodies, and you are played two different melodies and you have to say whether there's something different or not. And we found that across time, so in the left-hand graph, you can see that across the kind of test session, then their music detection ability is improving. Now our Bayesian analysis behind this would show strong evidence ratios between the kind of very final points, so this is 6 months after their 12-month lesson programme, versus when they'd started right at the very beginning. This is their baseline test session. And we also have strong evidence to support that change between the final point of the testing session, again, to the baseline. There's not much difference between these, even though they look like they're different. There is not much evidence in that model to suggest that they're much different to each other. But for us, we were interested in trying to answer, is it just the exposure to that musical task that has prompted this change in musical ability, or can we really tie it down to the musical tasks that we've been getting people to do? So here, instead, what we've done is now model it by how many blocks of training they have received across the different types of tasks we were asking people to do. And so here, when they have received both blocks of improvisation and replication, they have stronger skills than when they've received nothing. That's fine. But also when they've received just one block of replication as well. So having that improvisation seems to provoke some gains in that melodic detection ability. If you want to know more about some of those results, I would direct your attention to that PLOS One publication, which should be out anytime soon. And due to using Bayesian analysis, what we were able to model, in fact, was a counterfactual situation where we have the kind of test sessions by time, but they don't include any musical tasks, in fact, whatsoever. And what we can see there is the music detection ability doesn't change across that. So it's not just a question of being exposed to music learning, it's actually the tasks that cause a difference. So the main takeaway from this is the exposure to the music lessons is not the main ingredient, the music task matters. So perhaps we do need some more studies into different musical tasks and how that develops older adults' music education outcomes as well as their cognitive outcomes. I'm going to take a change of topic here. The past project that I was talking about was very much a traditional form of music education learning, albeit it was online, but it was in that format where there was a teacher and there was lessons and there was daily practice. What I've started working on since moving to the UK is thinking about different ways that we might engage older adults living with dementia to be musical with each other. So a much more kind of informal exposure of music learning and music making. So really thinking about what that might be and what technologies could we design to support that. Living with dementia, dementia is an umbrella term. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the many different types of dementia there are. There are at least over 100, but the most frequently occurring ones that we hear of are Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, frontotemporal, PCA mixed, but there are many, many different types. They also come with a raft of symptoms, so it's not just memory. It can be concentration, it can be language skills, confusion, oral and visual disturbances. And people have a journey through dementia. It is a progressive condition, so you may have someone who is in the very early stages, who is getting towards those kind of middle stages of dementia where things are a lot more challenging, right through to advanced dementia where people may or may not be non-verbal and not very kind of overly responsive. What I want to communicate there is when you have met one person with dementia, you have met one person with dementia, so everyone's experiences can be vastly varied. So how might we develop music technology for people living with dementia? There is actually a field of accessible music technology where people look at adaptive or inclusive instruments, and that really comes down to that intersection of design and critical disability studies that thinks about music education as being inaccessible due to the way it's been designed rather than any deficit with someone who has a disability or has dementia in being able to access that. So those access barriers are due to external factors there. Now, the majority of these accessible digital music instruments are tangible, so there is some physical element to them. Very few of them are touchscreen based, and they rely more on a physical gesture and that kind of tactile response. Not entirely, but in the majority there. I've just included a few pictures of some for those of you who may be unfamiliar with that field. And we were really interested in thinking about how many of these had been developed for dementia specifically. So looking at technology for arts widely, so not just thinking about music, but any type of art form, we did a kind of scoping review looking at 51 articles that described music, visual arts, storytelling, and the different technologies that people had made around these for people living with dementia. And again, the kind of overview of this kind of field was these technologies appeared to be more custom made rather than using those everyday technologies like iPads and smartphones. The devices were typically oriented towards individual users in an individual context rather than any sort of social aspect. And there was a fair amount of limited choice or adaptability to the user, even though it was often talked about. A bit of a precursor to this work was we did a project within a residential care home in Sydney. And here, the lifestyle coordinator, so the person in charge of different activities for the residents, was very aware of the residents' love of music, but he said, I need a way of them being able to interact with music together. Some of them have been musicians before, some have never touched a musical instrument in their life. Some have physical and cognitive challenges, and others don't. How do I get some piece of technology that will allow these people to meaningfully do music together? And so this was almost that kind of first exploration of what different interfaces might we use to allow people to do, in this case, group music making together. So they were playing different musical parts of familiar songs in this setting. And there's a couple of publications there that you can read through if you're interested in this. But for me to give you that brief kind of takeaway, essentially we did a very user-oriented design process, so we involved the older adults in giving us constant feedback on these surfaces and what was useful and what wasn't, which really kind of gave us the idea that these devices needed a great deal of flexibility for the different physical and cognitive needs. But probably something that isn't talked about so much was they need a really rich musical outcome. A lot of the time we design pieces of music technology and think about how people will interact with it, but the music is almost secondary. So the sounds that people were getting out of these things, our participants had a lot to say on the quality of sounds and the quality of music that they wanted to be able to produce. So that was a piece of work that really led on to what is happening in the UK right now. So here we take a very participatory research approach. And what this means is we're trying to conduct this research in a way that rebalances that power between us as designers and the people who we are trying to benefit from this research at the end of the day. Now, this is a negotiation that continues all the way through the project. We must be willing, as are the partners, to make decisions on research aims, methods and outputs that may not necessarily have been what we planned at the very start, but as the work evolves, we kind of make sure that this is going down a route that is meaningful for people living with dementia and with those with lived experience. So the way we've been carrying out this research is very different to the kind of controlled experimental studies that I've been talking about before, in that we've been doing a lot of community events over the past 4 years. Sometimes we discuss a lot with people what they want from musical interaction. Sometimes we're user testing devices. And sometimes we're trying to imagine the devices of the future. In the year 3000, how do you want to interact with a musical system? And what do you want it to behave and say to you? During all of this, essentially we've worked with at least 500 people in thinking about this musical topic from the point of living with dementia or caring for someone living with dementia. So part of this work is to do with device development. What we've done here is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the kind of Bill Gaber-esque approach of looking into that playful use of devices and seeing how people experience those and that informing a bit of design there. But essentially, the biggest thing that kept coming back to us was this, what I referred to at the beginning, this psychological barrier of people believing that they were not musical and therefore they shouldn't even touch the devices that we were talking about. So a lot of our device development came around how do we get over that psychological barrier. And three main concepts emerged as being particularly important. Agency, so the person living with dementia actually being in control of making the music. It seems like that should just happen, but in fact in a lot of different devices, they are not the person that is controlling the interface at all. Creativity became another one, so how do we design musical interactions that will allow some form of creativity, even if someone does not feel musical? And how do we design those settings so that people can relate to one another, so building and sustaining relationships? There's a couple of devices that we've been using that have been particularly successful. One is this Music Maker's Duet system on the left. It's an electronic version of the mechanical music box, so you spin the handle and the music plays. Well-known pieces of music are split into two separate streams, and so each user is controlling a stream of music. Most typically, one person has the song or the singer, and the other person has the rest of the instruments. Another device that we've been developing is what we call the slider box. So this is this wooden mixing desk analogy. And that was initially designed to support music listening, but here we developed something called the audio playgrounds. And that was our response in trying to design a system that would allow creativity for non-musicians. Thirdly, a PhD student, Michael Neokleos, is developing an AI-enabled system. Now, this is based on the Launchpad devices. This is an off-the-shelf device that you can buy, but he's working on the software underneath, being able to support musical conversations. So a way to respond to different users. I've kind of gone through that very quickly, but I do have a video that I can show you with some of these in action. I want to just say before I show that, why bother creating these pieces of technology? What added value might it bring? And one of the things that we've been looking at is this idea of spotlighting. So having a piece of musical technology that places the person living with dementia in control of the music will give them the command of the room or control of the activity that's going on. So attention flows to that person rather than an outside facilitator or musician. It gives a chance for group musical activity, and it may be a way to even the playing field for people living with dementia, carers and support workers. But we've also found that it can't just be any technology. As I said, tangible technologies appear to work best in this situation. Things that have an obvious gesture for use, which is why we've kind of kept with sliders and handles that spin, so they immediately suggest without words what you might have to do to use them, but also gives an option for extension without complexity. So how do we allow someone to be musically successful on a base level and build up their skills? So that kind of informal music learning and skill learning behind it. I will stop talking. I'm going to show you some of our videos, and you can see some of our collaborators and some of our community partners. And I do hope this sound works, so do let me know if this is coming through.
The music box is an electronic version of the older mechanical music box. It allows people to produce music simply by turning the handle. It has been designed to allow people with no musical training to play duets together, created from commercial recordings that have been split apart. This gives the voice to one person and the accompaniment to the other person, allowing them to perform meaningful music from their shared history together. For copyright reasons, we can't play you the audio, but people like to play and sing along to artists like the Beatles, Boney M., Joni Mitchell, Joe Cocker, as well as many others. Playing together in this group usually leads to a bit of singing.
The slider box was designed to be a highly accessible device to inspire interaction with music technology. It hides the complexity of computer-based platforms, using tactility and playability to inform interaction. These skills often last into the later stages of dementia. The audio playground experiences are like a choose-your-own-adventure story in sound. They enable users to combine musical elements in a variety of ways to enable a personalised and individual approach to music composition and experience.
What impact might a new device have in this group setting? Previous research shows that being in control of the music, whether that's deciding when to play the music or creating new musical material, really allows the individual to be the musical leader. The spotlight is on them and their musical contribution. As well as familiar music bringing a lot of pleasure and reminiscing, unfamiliar music can bring opportunities for creativity and exploration.
Zawsze lewej
Finally, using these devices may act as a springboard, triggering other musical activities. It helps people feel more confident about trying other musical activities for themselves. And just to add to that, I've got a little snippet of video from Michael's work with the AI software system that just shows you a little bit of how he's been trying to program musical conversations that adapt to the user input. So hopefully from those you can see a couple of situations how we've been designing those different musical experiences. And what we've been trying to do in the background here is record a lot of these video engagements, what we call musical engagements, to try and analyse the different engagement indicators from different people living with dementia and how their response and enjoyment and initiation might change across those different musical activities. So what is interesting here is this idea of spotlighting that I said, that people feel in control and the point of attention within the group. It doesn't happen all the time, even though it happens on numerous occasions. It doesn't happen when a person is feeling like they are accompanying group singing, or often when mixing stems of familiar music. So there are particular occasions where that comes out more than others. Though a lot of creative exploration is demonstrated by strong exhibiting of delight or laughter or playfulness. But there's also moments of disengaging, and these are as important to acknowledge as the kind of positive moments where individuals maybe don't want to take action or don't want to be inputting into the music. So it's this real intersection between what the social context is of the musical experience, what the motivation of the individual is, and the affordances of the device itself. One thing that the device platforms allowed us to do was an examination into how complexity might affect interaction for these kind of musical novices. And what we set up here was a slightly different scenario in that all of the musical engagements we'd recorded up until then, you could criticise that they were faced with a novel device, and so any sort of interaction was only just because that was the first time they'd used it. So here we ran a different type of program, where we had 2 groups over 3 sessions, over a period of a month, and they would just use one of the devices and build familiarity with that. And through those weeks, we scaffolded different musical activities, beginning with music listening, moving into what we call music exploration, where it was familiar tracks, but we were kind of exploring the different musical elements behind it, and then pushing people into the music creation side. And it's that music creation, it's that audio playgrounds that we then examined, looking at how the complexity of those different buttons and sliders might affect how people interact with those individual elements. So we just had a very small group of participants here, and that included people living with dementia, people also awaiting diagnosis, and their carers. And what we found from here, I mean, the design behind the audio playgrounds, and that was the wooden mixing desk looking device. We had sound playback in 2 forms. Either it was looped playback of content that was always there and people just had to move a slider up and down, or we had the one-shot items which were requiring a button press. There was no out-of-key notes, so you couldn't ever play a wrong combination of sounds, even though these were all unfamiliar. And there was very low latency between that button press and the oral action, and all of the technology underlying these processes were hidden. So no screen, no keyboard, no mouse operations required. What we've looked at in this particular study is the 8 different channels that we had on that device and the different complexity ratings. So when I say complexity, how many different actions could that button or slider trigger? So the single button triggers the same part with 2 to 3 possible options. It either goes just round in a round robin, or there is a random selection, as if we wanted one button to be a single note, but each time you pressed it, it would be a different note of the pentatonic scale, for instance. And the main kind of results from there is that having kind of looped content versus one-shot implementations were equally favoured, and these are the 2 different audio playgrounds that we looked at. But if you had a lower level of complexity, that generally resulted in a higher percentage interaction with that channel. So particularly for older adults living with dementia, the reliability of what that button is going to do was highly favoured. So if they knew that that button press was going to result in a particular action, then that was interacted with a lot more than the ones that were seemingly more random or had a lot more possibilities, which suggests that any sort of control needs to be limited to 1 or 2 actions. But this, again, was a very short-term study, so we may find that if somebody was to use this over a much longer term, then further learning might change that outcome. The final thing I'm going to talk about is the work that we've done on implementing these devices in different care settings. So I've kind of said, we've created these devices, but what do they mean? As with any bespoke system or program, the next stage of getting it out into a kind of real world context isn't as easy as just making it available to someone. So we have worked with Chef Care, which is a local residential care home in Sheffield. They have had one of these boxes installed on the wall since November 2023 in an effort to encourage unstructured music listening. And the results that we've been getting from this installation, in just the first 2 months of usage, they've been playing over 600 tracks. It's a very instantaneous device to use, and they had playlist content on there as well as recordings of residents talking about their life histories. But the issue with this, as much as we tried to design agency into the system, was that interactions were predominantly led by staff, and there was a bit of connection issues with the Bluetooth speaker that we'd sent along with the device. And I said there's a trade-off between installation and portability. So here we have a situation where they have it on the wall, but they're mentioning that they would like to be able to move it around into different residents' rooms. So we have started working with another 2 care companies one based in the UK and one in New Zealand. So with Colton Care, they want to use these devices in one-to-one interactions between care staff and residents, and this might happen in individual rooms or in common areas. And what they found, and this is particularly for the audio playgrounds that we're looking at, is there's a lot of use here for reminiscence that comes from hearing sounds, or it might just spark a conversation between two people, or it might also be useful as physical rehabilitation because the kind of knowledge that there are sounds underneath these buttons that need to be pressed up it's a call to action on someone to move their hand. So in terms of physical rehabilitation, that's been quite useful. And we found that it's as important to encourage non-musician care staff to use something like this as much as non-musician users, so that they know that this is possible to use without any particular experience. In a different type of use case, we're looking at this in Ryman Healthcare in New Zealand, where they hope to install it in a common living area. But there's a lot of work there around building support materials for care staff and family members to use. So there's more results to come from there. But certainly we're collaborating with a lot of different caring contexts to see how this kind of piece of technology might actually be used and supported in a real world scenario. What I want to leave this talk with is some takeaways around careful design of technology within music education or music learning contexts, whether that be a very formal or very informal settings. I'd like to challenge the blanket statement that music is good. If we assume that all music is good all of the time, it can lead to a loss of citizenship and the right not to like music. There are plenty of people who don't. We also have a danger of equating the value of all musical experiences, so there is a loss of nuance and a danger of role as the passive listener dominating. So if music is something that we just have to expose people to for health benefits, then their need of being in control and having that agency can be somewhat diminished. Is technology really the solution? Sometimes yes. Sometimes there are costs, setup requirements, maintenance, reliability issues that make putting something like this in a caring context quite difficult and costly to support. We also have to grapple with varying attitudes and competency towards using technology. And also I've mentioned before about how our thoughts about music education and learning can perhaps reduce or simplify the possibilities of making music that we could be designing in these instruments. So I want to leave you with another question, really. How do we enable full and meaningful participation for older adults and those living with dementia, such that they have possibilities for variety, creativity, openness, and perhaps that is the springboard towards future musical activity? So my 3 takeaway messages here is it's important to acknowledge the variety of goals any individual might have in coming to learn a musical instrument or wanting to take part in musical activity. The music and the sounds absolutely matter. There are so many comments on the thin, tinny, shrill sounds that these kind of technologies are producing. People are very aware of the timbre of musical sound, the recording that's being used, and the richness of the musical output. So these need to be very strongly focused on for future technology development. And really trying to balance this trade-off between reducing the interaction complexity, so keeping that simple, but not sacrificing the richness of output that people could produce. I'd like to thank my co-authors and my colleagues at Western Sydney University for the Active Minds Music Project, and our many community partners in research and colleagues at the University of Sheffield for the Music Dementia Technology Project. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for sharing the results of your research projects aiming at developing musical skills and social connection for older adults. I found it very informative and inspiring for us to re-examine the goals of music education. And just have a big feedback on the what you said at the beginning, that music does hold immense value, because most of the time we're looking at how students are doing in the practice rooms in the professional music education, or how they are doing in a general music setting. But seldom we are looking at how music could be connected to the reality and the real needs in the modern society. So I really enjoy your speech. Okay, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Can we take 2 or 3 questions before you answer them together? Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm a master student in the music department, majoring in music education and researching music education for older adults. Your lecture today gave me more ideas and confidence for course design. I'd like to ask, after using technology-assisted tools for teaching music, do you let participants try using traditional instruments a little again? Because I think when I tell the learners, or they just knew that the learning content is related to playing an instrument, it sets an expectation for them to actual play. However, playing an instrument in reality is very difficult. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting question. Yes, because I think when we are designing these tools, in part it's to expose people to musical experiences that they may not have had the chance to. But we are keeping in mind that this could be a springboard, as I said, to future musical activity. One thing that I'm very aware of is there's a lot of community choirs specifically for dementia in the UK. I'm not sure how similar that is across the world. And so people are being funneled into this, well, if you want to be musical, you should sing, go and join the choir. For a lot of people, singing is an incredibly daunting aspect. And so being able to explore different musical elements and even have that moment where they think, I do have something musically I can contribute. For us, that is a huge barrier that if they can overcome that, we do have reports of people then going back to an instrument perhaps they've learned in the past, or being more open to the idea of group singing or songwriting, because they feel that they have something musical to say. When in the past, there's a lot of negative experiences that people have had growing up. Perhaps they've been in a choir and they've been told to stand in the back and mime and not sing anything because they don't sound good. Or they've learned piano and they've disengaged because they've found it too difficult physically. So it's, in short, yes, we think that there's plenty of opportunity for designing new technologies that would act as that springboard to engage with music much more widely. Yeah.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Yao Jin from National Taiwan Normal University. Yeah, it's a pity you cannot visit us in person. Yeah, I hope next time you can go to our campus and we can learn more from you. Yeah, I'm impressed with your fruitful products and research about integrating music, technology, and elder studies. And I think you have contributed a lot to those who are in need. But I have one question is that, for example, in NTNU, most of our colleagues may not have so plenty of resources integrating 3 fields. So maybe many of them are in the field of music, or in the field of electronic engineering, or in the field of elder studies. So if it's possible for them to have their own research in some problems not that serious, like dementia, but maybe in mild cognitive impairment. And maybe just as our students just ask you, perhaps they can use something familiar with them, like a traditional music instrument, and they can treat problems not that serious, just what I just mentioned, that MCI. Or do you have any experiences using similar, not that complex technologies, or not do not need so many expertise? Then they can get into this field without so high threshold. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your take and your question. And yes, I would absolutely love to visit on another occasion in person. I think for thinking about this as a field in terms of how might we do research with limited resources, or perhaps much more widely existing instruments, I think this is something that music therapists do quite often in adapting existing tools. So I don't believe that you need a lot of technologies or a lot of extra pieces. The modifications can sometimes be extremely small, or there might be a support that is already existing in some other context that can be applied. My top piece of advice for researchers who want to look at this area is to try and understand what those issues and barriers are, and to think about what those solutions could be with the people that you hope to benefit. I have learned an incredible amount from our community partners and from people with lived experience that have reshaped my thinking into these different types of technologies. So I absolutely believe that there are plenty more solutions and supports that are perhaps already in existence in some other form that just need some careful thinking around how that might be used in a musical context.
Well, we can take one more question, please, Jenny. Well, if not, I would like to ask one question. For the improvisational musical task, you said that the older adults, they are given the task through oral guidance instead of notational. Okay, I would like to know how about their musical background or experience.
Yes, thank you. That is a good question, and that's made me realise that I forgot to write the word novice in there. So they were all musical novices, so they have never learned an instrument. If they have, it's been for less than 2 years, and probably when they were of school age. So we were looking at people who were very unfamiliar with music. The choice behind not using notation was from a number of pilot studies in the run-up to this using notation. We used staff notation. We'd also used figure notes, which is another kind of alternate notation system, in order to try and communicate those aspects of music theory. But the amount of barriers that we saw older adults experiencing from trying to interpret that visual information, we thought for this instance that the oral information would be useful. That's not to say that it didn't have problems as well, because in delivering through oral notation or oral prompts, you have to store that mentally before you can then translate it into physical actions to play. So this was not an easy task as well. I do have a PhD student in Australia who is looking into different forms of notation and how this might affect rate of learning in terms of those musical concepts. Because I think that is another area where we don't have a lot of empirical investigation yet to show what the supports might be in understanding those kind of musical blocks and being able to use different forms of notation or learning. So I think it's a very interesting area that requires a lot of different cognitive challenges. So I would be interested to work on that more.
So even they are music novices, they can still participate in a meaningful musical activity.
Right.
Yeah.
They were improvising better than I could, and I've learned piano my whole life.
Okay. It's about time to end this closed session. And finally, thank you so much for your wonderful keynote address and your online participation. We hope we can have an opportunity to see you in person in the near future. Okay, finally, let's give Dr. Jennifer McRitchie a warm round of applause for our presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Goodbye. Bye-bye. Bye.